The benefit of a zettelkasten over traditional forms of note-taking, which don't interconnect all of your notes through backlinks, is that even when you're not working on a specific project, every note that you take about what you think could become relevant later on and will be findable later on when you do have a specific project that requires that information. And so in the zettelkasten, it's a good idea to be taking random notes at all times. Like, you benefit from having more notes in your system even if you don't know what to do with them yet. If you're not familiar with the zettelkasten system, I recommend my earlier video on the topic, which is going to walk you through the basics and the foundations of this system. But basically, it's a system in which you take atomic notes, meaning they are very small and express only a single idea. And so instead of having a single notebook or document with 1,000 ideas, you're going to have 1,000 separate notes with just one idea each. And this is super beneficial because now those ideas are modular. Maybe I'm going to take this idea here and connect it to this idea here, but that doesn't prevent me from also later connecting it to this idea here. And because of these rich connections, every time you need a piece of knowledge, you're able to find it again just by looking at areas around it. So those are the two values that I keep in mind when growing my notes system: is keep notes atomic and interconnect them as much as possible. And that's really it. That's really all I think about when developing my notes and growing my zettelkasten system. I don't worry about tags. I don't really worry about plugins. I don't even really worry about any kind of distinction between fleeting notes and permanent notes. The only distinction I do make is between literature notes and my atomic notes, which are, I guess, my permanent notes, because when I read something or consume a piece of information, I'll stick all of my notes on that topic in a single literature note and then break those up accordingly. So my system is full of atomic notes, which is the main area of my Obsidian folder, which is the software that I use to grow my zettelkasten. And then I have a separate folder called sources, which is dedicated to all of the actual sources where I've gotten that information. But here is the issue I'm having with my zettelkasten currently. I mentioned at the top of this video that realistically, you should be taking notes about everything you think all of the time. You benefit from taking more notes, taking daily notes, spending time with your notes and developing connections and growing your zettelkasten. And this is something that I have done in the past. I have a lot of notes in my system, a lot of connections between those notes, and this has been very beneficial when writing my dissertation because in the research phase, I was just creating notes, and now all of the notes are there. Essentially, all of the writing for the first draft of my dissertation is in my system. I just need to put it in the correct order, and that has been hugely beneficial. I'm drafting my dissertation in Obsidian because I have all of the information and thoughts that I need right there at my fingertips, and it's easy to find. But now that I have that information, I'm in the writing phase of my dissertation, and so I'm not really growing my zettelkasten anymore. I'm just using it to work on this specific project. But I know this project is going to be over someday, and I'm going to want to work on a new project, and I'm going to want there to be notes in my system that are going to aid me in working on that project so that I can skip the brainstorming phase of that project and go straight into the creation phase, because all the brainstorming and research and note-taking has already been completed and is at my fingertips. So I want to still be taking notes on random things that come to my head every day, not just taking notes on things that are directly relevant to my PhD. Your PhD dissertation is supposed to be your entry into the research world. It is essentially supposed to be the worst piece of research that you do. So I don't want to put all of my note eggs in this basket. So to prevent my zettelkasten from solely being like a storehouse for notes about my dissertation, today I am going to use the Random Note Surfacer plugin, which is a core plugin in Obsidian, and I'll show you where to find it, to surface a random note from my system, and then I am going to take notes that are inspired by that note. That's right, I have no idea right now what I am about to take notes about in my system, but I am certain that my zettelkasten, being the good research partner that it is going to give me some great ideas when I sit down at my computer and I click give me a random note. My challenge is going to be when I get that random note from my system, I have to make notes that connect to this note. And they can connect to the notes that I connected to this notes, but I can't just randomly write a note. Everything has to be growing from connections. And there's really no note in my system right now that is perfect. They're all kind of in various levels of development, so I have no idea what this note-taking session is going to look like. I'm gonna take you along for the ride and we'll see where we get. I'm gonna do this a couple times and I'm just gonna give myself 10 minutes for each random note to take notes, and then when that 10-minute timer goes off, I'm gonna give myself a new random note and see where that one takes me. So here's to watering the garden that is my zettelkasten, and let's head over to the computer to see what notes we get. Okay, here we are at my computer desk, and we're going to take some random notes. First though, we need to make sure you know how to install the Random Note plugin. So here's my Obsidian. If you go down to the bottom left-hand corner of Obsidian into the settings, and then go down to core plugins, you can find, in alphabetical order, all the core plugins. We're gonna turn on Random Note, and that is going to open a random note to rediscover or review, which is exactly what we want. Once you've got that turned on, there's going to be a new icon on the left of your screen, which is a little die, and when you hover over it, it says open a random note. That's all we need to get started on this work session. I'm going to open a random note, get my music playing, and then I'm just gonna work for 10 minutes. So let me put 10 minutes on the clock, and after I'm done taking the note, I'll talk you through what I did and what I got done. So let's see what Obsidian gives me. Juggling teaches us life skills because of its simplicity. And first things first, what I'm gonna do is actually open up the local graph view so that I can also see what is around this note so that I can effectively take notes about it. But 10 minutes is on the clock, and we're starting now. And there's my timer going off, but I'm just gonna finish this one thought because I was connecting things together and I don't wanna lose that connection idea. Okay, there we go. There's my note-taking for literally just 10 minutes on this random topic, which was juggling teaches us life skills because of its simplicity. And I started out by opening the local graph view so that I could see what else was around that idea and get inspired just from what Obsidian or my zettelkasten was putting in front of me. In the first part of this note, I write that Penn Jillette says that 80% of getting good at juggling is just showing up, and juggling specifically makes that very obvious. And I think that running also makes this very obvious. So I created a note called Running is Empowering because you see progress when you put in work. And that title might change. When I'm first developing a note, I give it a title that is like the thesis, or what I think is going to be the thesis of the note, and then I write the note, and then I try to figure out a better way to say the thesis of the note, because although I want my titles to be very descriptive of what is inside a note, I also want them to be very short so that I can know what the topic of every note is when I'm on the left-hand side of my screen. So I took this note and I just described how I feel when I'm running, and I actually connected it to another idea that was connected to the original idea, which is the idea that you can't cheat at juggling, because when you drop, it's pretty obvious, and when you run, if your goal is like 5K, you can't run 4K and say, oh, but I did 5K. That doesn't really work. So I connected it to that idea. I also created the note for running, and that's just a placeholder note for right now. You can see that "You Can't Cheat at Juggling" is a bright purple, whereas the note for running right now, the link is dark purple. You know what? Let me just click into it and show you anyway. So now I've got a place to collect all my ideas about running, and if you look on the right hand side, I already have, wow, 4 notes already connected to the idea of running. 3 of those notes I made today, or rather, I connected the note running to my note on What I Talk About When I Talk About Running by Haruki Murakami today, and then I created those other 2 notes today. So that's actually where I went next. After making this note about running, I realized that Murakami says some similar things to what I'm saying here, and I went back to his ideas to see if I could find anything else to write about. I did find the idea that writing consists of focus and endurance, and that running kind of trains focus and endurance in you. So it's nice to pair those things together, which I extended to the idea that juggling also teaches focus and endurance. And perhaps the reason that juggling is able to do that is because of its simplicity. I formed those connections by creating this note called "Writing is Focus and Endurance." And I connected it to the idea of running, and then I created the note "Juggling Teaches Focus," which I connected to the idea that juggling teaches us life skills because of its simplicity. I connected, of course, to the note on juggling, which now you can see on the right-hand side has a lot of connections to it. So you can see that I'm really densely connecting. I created maybe 4 notes in this session in just 10 minutes, but I grew a lot more connections than I created new notes. All right, let's open another random note. Here we go. Okay, this is very interesting. This is an article that I read many years ago. It is from a special edition of the Drama Review, I think, specifically on new materialism and performance practices. And this one is by Amelia Jones on material traces, performativity, artistic work, and new concepts of agency. It looks like I have tossed in some quotes and some notes about this article. There are surprisingly few, and it looks like I still need to add some. And if I scroll down, you can even see that the article is literally in my Obsidian so that I can take further notes. We'll see what happens. I am going to start the timer, 10 minutes on the clock, and we'll see how much we can get through. This is very helpful that this note surfaced actually, because if you see on the right-hand side, there are currently no backlinks pointing towards this note, and that is a bit of a problem. It looks like there's also no notes pointing towards other notes here, so I would not have found this again, basically. I did a bad thing in the past when I put this note in here without any connections of any direction. So let's get going. I'm gonna click play on my timer and I'll see you in 10 minutes. There's the timer going off again, and this was a very different but still productive 10 minutes. I started by realizing that I know a juggling piece that exemplifies Jones's point in this article very clearly. A piece called Mandala by the Institute of Juggleology, where they juggle hollowed out props. They fill them with sand so that and put a hole in the side of them so that as they juggle and pass with each other, the sand falls out and it creates a sand painting on the ground. So this performance art of juggling has created a visual art of the sand painting. And the movements that were made in the performance art are now visible there's traces of them, as Jones would say, in the visual art. So first of all, I had to go and make a note dedicated to this performance piece, a source note called Mandala. But of course, in order to create the note for this performance piece, I had to create a note for the group itself that made this performance piece so that I can credit them. So I did that. I created an Institute of Juggleology note immediately. I made some links. So I linked to juggling is a temporal art and juggling is kinetic sculpture. And I'm also realizing that I should add juggling here, so I'm going to do that at the bare minimum. So finally, once I had notes dedicated to juggleology and their piece Mandala, finally I needed to create the note where I wanted to use Mandala as an example for Jones's discussion. So I created something called hybrid art, in which visual art has traces of performance art. Maybe this will end up being a note where I just store a bunch of examples of this concept. And I've also written down here what Jones says about this concept from the article that I had already quoted in here. And then I also created a note for relational ontology, which is an idea coming from Karen Barad's 2003 article, Posthuman Performativity. Of course, I didn't make this note from Barad, I made it from Jones. So I just mentioned that it is discussed in Barad, and that's probably going to remind me in the future to go and look at Barad if I actually want to reference this idea, not look at Jones, because Jones is only referencing it from Barad. But I also said that Jones describes it in this way. So now, if I'm ever discussing the idea of relational ontology in a paper or possibly my dissertation, I now have multiple people's ideas about what this idea is that I can now work with. And then I realized that I had kind of exhausted ideas from the quotes I already had in this note, so I went back to start rereading this article. I will say it was super helpful to have the article right here in Obsidian, because when I wasn't sure which Barad article relation ontology was mentioned in, I can go down to the works cited where I can find what the actual reference is. That's what I did in that 10-minute session. It's just mind-blowing how much you can get done in 10 minutes if you focus yourself. And now for this final 10-minute note-taking session, I actually am going to choose which note I am going to make notes about, because this video is sponsored by Skillshare, and I have been watching through a learning path on Skillshare on creative nonfiction writing, and I'm finally onto the final lesson in that learning path, which is by the nonfiction writer and reporter Susan Orlean, who wrote The Orchid Thief, which I read a few years ago. And she's a really prolific, wonderful writer, so I really wanted to take her Skillshare class, which has been super helpful so far. I'm about halfway through, and I have taken a ton of notes about it in Obsidian for my zettelkasten, but I have not yet formed any connections amongst the rest of my zettelkasten about the notes I've taken about this course. So I am going to start from my literature note on Susan Orlean's Skillshare class, and as I take my notes, I'm going to pass you over to VoiceOver Morgan to tell you a little bit about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. 10 minutes on the clock, here we go. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes led by industry professionals in many creative fields, from writing to programming to illustration. There are two things that make Skillshare stand out for me. First are their learning paths, which are hand-picked classes from across the platform meant to be taken in order that build on one another to reinforce their lessons. And second are their projects, which members can complete alongside the lessons and share with their fellow learners. Joining Skillshare is a way to take your career, skills, or side hustle to the next level, and the first 500 people to click the link below my video will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So invest in yourself and support my channel by pressing the link below and getting yourself 30 days free of Skillshare. My timer's going off, but I am just going to finish this thought. A lot of thoughts went through my head with that one. Here's my note on Susan Orlean's Skillshare class. I knew that this was going to be relevant to ideas about writing, and I already have a lot of ideas about writing in my zettelkasten. So I just started with any idea about writing, and the note I ended up taking was good writing is good writing. Genre doesn't matter. I pulled a quote from Orlean, I tagged it with writing, and then I opened up the graph view for writing so I could get more ideas. One idea that I found was actually the idea that you should write what you love, which came from the Haruki Murakami notes that I had referenced earlier in my first example today. When you actually get into a note-taking session, these things build off of each other. Because I had just accessed that note, it was fresh in my mind and I could find the connection here, which reminds me that there's so many more connections that could be being made in my zettelkasten that I'm not making because they're just not fresh in my mind, which is why it's important to be doing this every single day and all the time that you can. And the idea from Murakami that I remembered was that you will always be better at things you enjoy. Couldn't really find a way to connect that earlier to something, but I did now because Orlean says that you should only write about things that pique your curiosity. Then I took a note just called choosing a writing topic because she has a lot of advice for how to choose a writing topic, and I thought that could be a good space to just store advice. If I'm ever struggling to come up with a writing topic now, I can just go to my note called choosing a writing topic, and here I can collect advice from many different writers about how to do that. So I just made into a heading the Susan Orlean one so that I know that everything under that heading is from Susan Orlean, and when I add more writers in here, I'll make a heading for them as well. And then I took a more specific note about writing topics, which is that a topic for writing should be specific, but also speak to the universal. And this is something I tell my students a lot, so I wanted a note in here about that, and I didn't tag writing. Oops. So I'm gonna do that right now so that I don't lose that. And then finally, a note called research requires unpreparedness, which is something that Orlean says that you shouldn't go into reporting on a story knowing very much. You should just enter the field and then find things out while you're in the field, because otherwise you won't get that spark of curiosity and confusion, and you won't get that emotional journey that is learning about a thing. And when you do have that emotional journey, you can put it into your writing. And I related this to the idea that academic thinking can restrict thought, and just the idea in general that if you have knowledge about a thing already, it's harder to gain new or different knowledge about that thing. You're kind of biased towards what you already know. So I also made an alias for this note, which means that this note can be called research requires unpreparedness, but it could also be referred to as research requires not knowing, because this not knowing is something that comes up a lot in performance studies scholarship and adjacent fields. So I thought that would be useful to be able to refer to, and now I'm gonna have to go make a bunch of connections around that thing. Anyway, that was a lot of note-taking. I hope this video wasn't too long for you. I hope it was helpful and interesting to see how I take notes about something random, and just the idea that you should be taking notes about random things, because as you saw, as I was taking notes, just referring to something and then shortly after referring to something else means that that previous thing is still fresh in my mind, and I can actually build connections to that next thing. If I didn't have something fresh in my mind, I wouldn't make those connections as easily. It requires a lot more work. So for the note-taking process within a zettelkasten system to be sort of seamless and require very little energy, you need to be doing it a lot, frequently, probably every day for a little bit of time, so that these ideas are fresh in your mind. I am going to end this video here. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. You can use the link below to get a 30-day free trial of Skillshare, and that really helps out my channel as well. And I'll see you in another video again soon. Bye, everybody!